Great to be with you on a Sunday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Yehuda in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, John in Maine, Shandor in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Nancy, North Carolina, Paula in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Elvis in New York, Guy in Ohio, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Tom in PA, Ella in the house, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to dedicate tonight's learning to my very, very close friend, David Ben Mindel Shena. He passed away this morning after a long and difficult illness, and the family, was relieved that the suffering has ended. But David, I love you, my holy brother. I love you so much. And may our learning today accrue to your merit and lift you even a little higher in the world of souls, in the world of truth. I know you have a beautiful portion in that world. And I'd just like to mention, as a public service announcement, that, end-of-life arrangements, don't wait till the end of life to think about it. A Jew should not be cremated. A Jew should be buried. It's what our tradition holds and has held for over 3,000 years. Whether a person is quote-unquote religious or not, observant or not, Orthodox, conservative, reformed, atheist, all these kinds of labels, that's like Johnny-come-lately stuff. In Jewish history, this idea, for example, Orthodox, Reform, those labels have only existed for a couple hundred years in a history that's 3,500 years old. It's like this stuff just popped up. It's meaningless. Those kinds of differences are meaningless. But the tradition to bury our dead, as we learn in the Torah, that is sacred and so important. Don't wait, until a family is in the midst of grief to deal with those issues. Make sure that about yourself, you've talked to your loved ones, that's what you want. If you think you have a loved one who is Jewish and might not want that, talk to them now. Talk to them about why it's so important. This is the last rite of a Jew. It's not it wasn't some kind of accident or coincidence that the Nazis, who could have disposed of all of the bodies of the Jews that they murdered more cheaply, quickly, efficiently by just digging big holes and throwing them in it, but they chose the crematoria on purpose. That was like a further attack, not only on the Jews that they had killed, but on Jews everywhere, because they studied Jewish wisdom, Jewish history, and they knew what an affront to the Jewish soul it is to destroy the body that carried that soul around. And they did that on purpose, so let's not do their work for them. And it's also something that people should know, that a Jewish community will step up and help a family if they have financial need to arrange burial. There's a Hevra Kadisha in every city, and they will help you. People will step up. Finances should never be part of that question. And by the way, I just don't speak about the traditions of other people. I only know, to speak about Jewish tradition, but I know that this idea certainly exists in other traditions. I'm sure Bill could comment on this. But what it does for the children, what it does for the families, to have a final resting place, to go and sit and commune with the soul of the departed, is very important. And I'm not in any way commenting on people who've made personal choices in their lives. I'm just talking about, looking to the future for yourself, for loved ones. If it's a conversation you haven't had, if it's a conversation, you have a parent who's older, maybe you should have that conversation. I'll just say that in our extended family, we were able to have conversations like that with older people in the family. And when they heard how important this is and why it's so meaningful, they said, if you feel that way about it, sure. I understand what you're saying. Yes, let's do burial instead of this. These are not easy conversations to have, but they're important conversations to have, and much better to do them, when it can be calm conversation and not in the midst of difficult times. Okay, let's get to our learning today. Our daf is page 32, Lamed Beis, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 11 here in chapter 2. We're actually going to pick it up toward the bottom of page 31b. And we're talking about when can we assume that an animal is lost and that the obligation to return it to its owner kicks in, which can easily mean take care of that animal until the owner steps forward. And it's a big obligation. So when are there times that a person doesn't have to do that is also part of the discussion that we're talking about here. Okay, the Mishnah, so near the bottom of 31b, the Mishnah taught that if in the course of tending to and returning the lost item, the finder was idle from labor that would have earned him a sela, so there's a high-paid individual, he shall not say to the owner of the item, give me a sela to compensate me for my lost income. Rather, the owner gives him his wage as if he were a laborer, right? So a lawyer, who makes $1,000 an hour, very high priced, can't say, I spent 3 hours returning your lost item, give me $3,000. All he can say is, I spent 3 hours returning your lost item, I'd like to be compensated for my time, and okay, you'll get minimum wage. And so rather, the owner gives him his wage as if he were a laborer, and the Gemara cites that we learned in a Baraisa, the owner gives him his wage as if he were an idle laborer. So the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of as if he were an idle laborer? And in fact, he is not idle, but he's engaged in return of a lost item. So Abaye said it means that he is paid as a laborer who is idle from that typical labor from which he is kept idle. In other words, he must receive the amount of money that a person would be willing to accept to refrain from his current occupation and engage in returning a lost item. And this calculation accounts for both the degree of difficulty of his steady employment and the amount of his remuneration. Now, the Mishnah taught if there are 3 men there who can convene as a court, so he may stipulate before the court that he will undertake to return the item, provided that he receives full compensation for lost income. And the Gemara will relate an incident about this. Now, let me just read what the law is before, because this debate gets a little complicated. So, first of all, about remuneration for returning a lost item. This is where the law ended up in Shulchan Aruch. One who has no employment and finds a lost item, he must return it without payment, as that is the mitzvah. That's what he's commanded to do. If he was employed and he interrupted his work in order to return the item, then he receives remuneration, but the remuneration of an idle laborer, which according to the Rambam means the sum that a laborer would be willing to accept in order to remain idle, right? That he might accept less than, if he's getting paid, let's say $25 an hour to do backbreaking work, maybe he would accept $20 an hour to do nothing. Right, so you understand? So it doesn't even need to rise to the level of his current salary. And the Rima cites Rashi, who states that it is the amount in pay that a laborer would accept in order to move from a grueling occupation to a less strenuous occupation. For example, returning a lost item. The Shach explains, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbeinu Hananel, that one receives the payment that he would receive for performing his labor at a time when salaries are low due to low demand. Now, all of this applies in a case where one chooses to return the item. If his standard wage is significant and he is unwilling to lose that sum, right? If the lawyer is unwilling to go from being compensated $1,000 per hour to $20 per hour, and he is unwilling to lose that sum, then he may prioritize his own interests and disregard the lost item. In that situation, because he would be giving up so much of his own salary in order to return the lost item, he would be permitted to disregard the item because the difference, right, is so significant. But if he was already just earning a wage that's, comparable, not so far off from what he could ask, for having his time compensated for returning the lost item, then he can't disregard. Now, with regard to this idea that one could say, well, the only reason I'm willing to return the lost item is because I expect to be paid at this higher rate. Pertinent to that discussion will be the following law. In the case of a partnership in which no time was predetermined for its dissolution, or where a time was predetermined and that time has arrived, in order to dissolve the partnership without the knowledge of his partners, he must do so in the presence of a court consisting of 3 men, and the 3 may even be laymen, provided that they are trustworthy and experts in asserting the value of property. And this law applies only to people who are partners in the ownership of various types of property or property whose value is not clear. If they are partners in one type of property whose value is clear, for example, one type of currency, the partnership can be dissolved even with no court. Right? And why is that relevant? Because the Mishna said that you can convene a court of 3 and establish before that court that the only reason you're willing to return the lost item is because you're expecting to be paid at a higher rate, and then you might be paid at that higher rate. It's a more complicated law, but based on that, we're going to go into a little digression here. So the Gemara relates, Isser and Rav Safra formed a joint venture with each other, and Rav Safra went and dissolved their partnership without Isser's knowledge in the presence of 2 witnesses. And Rav Safra came before Rabba bar Rav Huna in order to ratify the dissolution of the partnership. And Rabba bar Rav Huna said to him, go and bring me the court of 3 before whom you dissolved your partnership. Alternatively, you may bring 2 of the 3 of them to testify that you dissolved the partnership before them, or alternatively, bring 2 witnesses to testify that you dissolved the partnership before a court of 3. And Rav Safra said to Rabba bar Rav Huna, from where do you know this law, that dissolution of the partnership may be accomplished only before a court? And Rabba bar Rav Huna said to him, it is as we learned in the Mishnah, if there are 3 men there who can convene a court, he may stipulate before the court that he will undertake to return the item, provided that he receives full compensation for lost income. But if there is no court there before whom we can stipulate this condition, then what? So rather, in that case, his own financial interests take precedence. That's why the lawyer can disregard the lost item, and he need not return the lost item, right? If he's going to give up that much income in order to return the lost item, he doesn't need to. So apparently, one stipulates binding conditions with regard to another person's property only before a court. And Rav Safra said to Rabba bar Rav Huna, is that the case in the Mishnah? Is that case in the Mishnah comparable to this case? There, where he is removing property before the possession of this person and giving it to that person, we require a court. But here, referring to himself in the third person, he's merely taking his own property and not the property of any other person. There is no transaction effected here. It is mere disclosure of the matter that he divided the joint property equitably, and 2 witnesses are sufficient for him to disclose that fact. Rav Safra cites proof, and know that this is so, as we learned in the Mishnah, tractate Ketubot, that a widow owed sustenance from her husband's estate sells the property of the estate when not before a court. So apparently one need not involve the court when reclaiming property that belongs to him. Abaye said to him, but wasn't it stated with regard to that Mishnah that Rav Yosef bar Menyumi says that Rav Nachman says The court before which a widow sells property of the estate need not be a court of experts, but is required to be at least a court of laymen. Therefore, as in the parallel case of the widow, even when disclosing that one took property belonging to him, 2 witnesses are not sufficient and a court is required, right? So if you are going to be involved in disposing of assets, unilaterally, so then you better get a court involved. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 11. Now, Mishnah number 12 here in chapter 2 of Tractate Bava Metzia. If one found an animal in a stable belonging to its owner, he is not obligated to return it to its owner. Sounds obvious, right? How is the animal lost if you found it in the stable that belongs to its owner? Answer, maybe the owner has stables all around. Some of them are in great disrepair. And the fact that an animal was in such a stable doesn't actually mean that it's in a right and secure place. That might be a dangerous place that the lost animal actually wandered to because it was familiar, but not a safe place for it to be. However, says the Mishnah, if one found an animal in a stable belonging to its owner, the finder is not obligated to return it. If he found the animal in a public area, he is obligated to return it. And if the animal was lost in a graveyard and a priest found it, all right, a kohen, he may not become impure to return it. In other words, we mentioned this already, that the positive mitzvah to return a lost item does not come and override the negative prohibition of a kohen to enter a graveyard and become impure for the dead, nor the positive mitzvah of a kohen to be holy unto his God. So even to return a lost item, the kohen, the priest, doesn't enter a graveyard. And if the Kohen's father said to him, become impure, or in a case where one was obligated to return the animal, and his father said to him, do not return it. So he may not listen to his father, as one may not violate Torah law to honor his father, right? We must honor our parents. That's the 5th commandment of the 10 commandments. But if your parent tells you to violate a Torah law, then even though you're commanded to honor your parents, you don't listen to them if they tell you to violate a law. If one unloaded a burden from an animal that was collapsing under its weight, and then later loaded items back onto the animal, and after that and later than that, he unloaded and loaded again, even if this scenario repeats itself 4 or 5 times, he is obligated to continue, in other words, helping the owner unload and load, as it is stated, Exodus 23:5, if you see the donkey of him that hates you, even your enemy, right, collapsed under its burden, you shall forego passing him by, and you shall release it with him. Azov te azov. As we were talking about yesterday, that doubling of the verb teaches you that you do this over and over again if necessary. Or some say that the doubling doesn't teach you that. The first use teaches you that, and the second, according to Rava, teaches a different lesson. But at any rate, you have to load and unload as many times as necessary. And it is derived from the verse that one is obligated to perform the action as needed, even several times. If the owner went and sat and said to a passerby, since there is a mitzvah incumbent upon you to unload the burden, if it is your wish to unload the burden, unload it. So in such a case, the passerby is exempt, right? In other words, if the owner of the animal just says, listen, I'm beat. I'm not going to help unload my animal. But you have a mitzvah, so if you'd like to perform the mitzvah of unloading an animal, go right ahead. Yeah, that's not the scenario that the Torah is talking about. You got to help the owner. You don't do the owner's work for him because of this mitzvah, right? So if the owner went and sat and said, well, since there's a mitzvah on you to unload the burden, if it is your wish, unload the burden. In such a case, the passerby is exempt. As it is stated, you shall release the animal from its burden with him, meaning with the owner. If the failure of the owner to participate in the unloading of the burden was due to the fact that the owner is old or infirm, then the passerby is obligated to do the loading or unloading even by himself. There is a mitzvah by Torah law to unload a burden, but there is no mitzvah to load it. And Rabbi Shimon says there is even a mitzvah to load the burden. And Rabbi Yosef HaGalili says if there was a burden upon the animal greater than its typical burden, one need not attend to it, as it is stated under its burden, i.e. the obligation is with regard to a burden that the animal can bear. You're not going to get involved in loading an animal with a burden that it can't bear, right? I mean, in other words, if the owner of the animal is torturing the animal, you're not going to participate in that torture, though you might rescue the animal from that burden. And now what we're going to get into, where we're headed with this discussion, is, first of all, is it an obligation? Do we learn from this mitzvah to load and unload animals that there is a commandment to save animals from suffering? And if so, is that commandment by Torah law or by rabbinic law, right? Torah law or rabbinic decree. So that's where we're headed. Now, the Gemara on Mishnah 12. The Mishnah teaches that if one found an animal in a stable, he need not return it to its owner. So Rava said the stable that the sages mentioned in the Mishnah is one that neither encourages the animal to stray nor secures the animal so that it will not flee. And the Gemara explains Rava's statement. That it does not encourage the animal to stray is learned from the fact that the Tana of our Mishnah teaches he is not obligated in its return, right? If it was a place where you found the animal that you know it's going to stray away from there, well, then it is a lost animal that needs tending. The Mishnah taught that if you find it in this barn, in this stable that belongs to its owner, you don't have to return it. It must be that it's safe enough from straying and becoming further lost. The fact that it does not secure the animal is learned from the fact that it was necessary for the Tana to teach he is not obligated in its return. I mean, obviously, if the animal was in its home stable, the place where the owner, keeps his animal, the place where you could return the animal to once you found it and returned it, if the animal was already there, obviously you don't have to return the animal. Why would we have to teach that at all? So we must be talking about a place that is secure enough that you don't have to step in and return the animal to some more secure place, but that is, open enough that the question is worth mentioning, right? So that's why they're talking about this intermediate stable, which is one that neither encourages the animal to stray nor secures the animal so that it will not flee. So the Gemara continues its explanation of Rava's statement. As if it enters your mind to say that it is a stable that secures the animal, that ruling would be extraneous. Now that in a case where one found the animal outside a stable, he brings it inside a stable of that type and thereby returns the animal to its owner, right? Even if the owner's away, you have fulfilled your obligation to return his animal if you put it in the owner's stable. You don't have to give it to the owner. The owner doesn't even have to know that you returned the animal as long as you placed it in a location that is secure and belongs to the owner. So rather, learn from this that the stable mentioned in our Mishnah does not secure the animal completely, and therefore there is a possibility that the animal will stray, and therefore that one must return it to a more secure place belonging to the owner. And the Gemara affirms, indeed learn from it, that it is a stable, the one mentioned in the Mishnah, that neither encourages the animal to stray nor secures the animal from fleeing. The Mishnah teaches, if one found an animal in a stable belonging to its owner, he is not obligated to return it. Rabbi Yitzchak says, and that is the law only in a case where the animal is standing within the city limits. And the Gemara concludes by inference that if the animal is found in a public area, he is obligated to return it. And even if it was within city limits, he is also obligated to return it. And there are those who teach this statement with regard to the latter clause of the Mishnah, that if he found it in a public area, he's obligated to return it. And Rabbi Yitzchak says, and that is the law only in a case where the animal is standing beyond the city limits. And the Gemara concludes by inference that in a case where the animal is found in the stable, even if the animal is standing beyond the city limits, he is also not obligated in its return because it's secure enough. Not so secure that it was, that's why it's worth mentioning, but secure enough that you don't have to get involved. New subject, the Mishnah teaches, and if the animal was lost in a graveyard and was found by a priest, let's say spotted by a priest, a kohen, so the kohen may not become impure by entering the graveyard in order to return the animal. In a case where a kohen's father said to him, become impure, or in a case where one was obligated to return the animal and his father said to him, don't return it, so he may not listen to his father. And the Gemara cites a baraisa in which the sages taught, from where is it derived that if a kohen's father said to him, become impure, or that if a non-kohen's father said, do not return a lost object that you found, that the finder should not listen to him. So this is derived from the verse as it is stated, quote, every man shall fear his mother and his father, and you shall observe my Shabboses. I am the Lord. That's Leviticus 19:3. Now, from the fact that the verse concludes, I am the Lord, it is derived that you are all, parent and child alike, obligated in my honor, meaning God's honor. Therefore, if a parent commands his child to refrain from observing a mitzvah, a commandment, he must not obey his father's command. And the Gemara infers the reason that a kohen must not obey his father's command to become impure is because the merciful one writes, you shall observe my Shabboses, I am the Lord. But if it were not so, I would say that the child must obey him. And the Gemara asks, but why? This obligation to obey a parent is a positive mitzvah, as it is written, honor your father and your mother, Exodus 20:12. And that obligation of a kohen to refrain from becoming impure is both a prohibition to the dead among his people, he shall not defile himself, Leviticus 21:1, and the positive commandment, you shall be holy, Leviticus 19:2. And the principle is that a positive mitzvah does not come and override a prohibition and a positive mitzvah together. So the Gemara answers that the derivation, you shall observe my Shabbos, is I am the Lord, was necessary, as it might enter your mind to say, since honoring one's father and mother is equated to the honor of the Holy One, as it is stated there, honor your father and your mother, and it is stated elsewhere, honor the Lord with your wealth, Proverbs 3:9. Therefore, one might have thought that the kohen must obey his father's command to become impure. Therefore, the Torah teaches us that the kohen is commanded not to listen to him if his father is telling him to violate a Torah law. The Mishna teaches, back to our Mishnah, there is a mitzvah, a commandment, by Torah law to unload a burden, but, says the Mishnah, there is no mitzvah, no commandment to load it. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the phrase, but there is no mitzvah to load it? If we say that it means, but there is no mitzvah to load it at all, well, what is different about unloading, with regard to which it is written, you shall release it with him, right? The animal struggling under its burden, and the owner is unable to unload the animal, so you have to help him, even if he's your enemy, right, to prevent the suffering of the animal. Where was I? You shall release it with him. I'm sorry, so let me say, but there is no mitzvah to load. So if we say that it means there is no mitzvah to load at all, then what is different about unloading, with regard to which it is written, you shall release it with him? With regard to loading as well, isn't it written, you shall lift them with him? Now, lift them is a little bit tricky. Like, doesn't that mean that you're helping the animal that is loaded to stand up? Or does it mean you shall help even your enemy load his animal, right, in such a way that you're supporting the animal as it's being loaded and getting the stuff onto the animal, in a way that is not going to overburden the animal, but where loading and unloading seem to be part of the same mitzvah? So the Gemara answers, Rather, there is a mitzvah by Torah law to unload the burden for free. You can't ask for payment for that. But there is no mitzvah to load the animal for free. Rather, the mitzvah of loading is performed with remuneration. You can ask, the person who needs your help to load the animal to pay you for your time. And the Gemara states, we learn by inference from the Mishna that which the sages taught explicitly in a baraisa. Unloading is performed for free, and loading is performed with remuneration. And Rabbi Shimon said both this and that are performed for free. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason for the opinion of the rabbis, the majority, that there is a distinction between unloading and loading with regard to remuneration for the one who's spending his time helping? And the reason is that if it enters your mind that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, let the merciful one write only the commandment of loading, and then he would not need to write the mitzvah of unloading. And I would say, just as with regard to loading, when there is no potential suffering of animals and there is no potential monetary loss for the owner, one is obligated to load the burden. Then with regard to unloading, where there is potential suffering of animals and there is potential monetary loss for the owner, is it not all the more so clear that one is required to help unload the burden? So rather, with regard to that law, with regard to what law did the merciful one write the mitzvah of unloading? It is to tell you the mitzvah of unloading the burden is performed for free, but the mitzvah of loading is performed with remuneration. And the Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Shimon, who holds that even loading is performed for free, what is the reason that the Torah writes the mitzvah of unloading? And the Gemara answers, it is because the verses are not clearly defined, and it is unclear which of the verses refers to loading and which refers to unloading. Had the Torah written one verse, it would have been interpreted with regard to unloading, and there would be no source that one needs to load an animal. And the rabbis could ask, why does Rabbi Shimon say that the verses are not clearly defined? Here it is written, collapsed under its burden, right? That's about unloading, which is clearly referring to a case of a burden that needs unloading. And there it is written, fallen down by the way, indicating that both the animals and their burdens are lying on the way and are in need of loading, right? Helping them to get up. And Rabbi Shimon explains that the verses are not defined because the phrase fallen down by the way could be understood as indicating that the animals are fallen with their burdens upon them and referring to unloading. So very interesting. What they meant by fallen by the way is the stuff on the animal fell off, and you have to help the owner get the stuff back on the animal. The other interpretation is, no, what it means is that the animal fell down with its load on it, and you're going to just help the animal rise. And you might need to unload to help the animal rise, and then you're just loading to help replace the burden. You can see how loading and unloading are intertwined. Rava says, now we're on page 32b, from the statements of both of these Tanaim, the sages of the Mishnah, it can be learned that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is by Torah law. As even Rabbi Shimon says that he disagreed with the opinion of the rabbis only because the verses are not clearly defined. But had the verses been clearly defined, we would have learned the same kal v'chomer inference. Due to what factor can that inference be learned? What is it not due to the matter of suffering of animals, which is a factor in unloading and not a factor in loading, that we would have learned the kal v'chomer inference? Okay, let's just keep going. Kal v'chomer means if we learn out that in the case of loading, you have to help when there's not even suffering of animals involved, then how much more so in the case of unloading, where there is suffering of the animals involved, that you have to help, right? That's the kal v'chomer. But the Gemara rejects that proof. Perhaps the kal v'chomer inference is due to the fact that there is the factor of monetary loss in unloading, but not in loading. And this is what the rabbis are saying. If in the case of loading, where if one fails to assist the owner, there is no potential monetary loss, one is obligated to help load the animal, then in the case of unloading, where if one fails to assist the owner, there is potential monetary loss because his, beast of burden could die. then is it not all the more so clear that one is required to help unload the burden? So the Gemara asks, but is there no potential monetary loss in loading? Are we not also dealing with a case where in the meanwhile, while the owner awaits for assistance, he will be prevented from bringing his merchandise to the marketplace in time to sell it? Alternatively, thieves might come and take all the merchandise that is there with him. Therefore, no, a kal v'chomer inference can be learned on the basis of monetary loss, and the inference must be based on the matter. It cannot be learned on the basis of monetary loss, because that could happen either way. It must be that we're talking about suffering of animals is by Torah law, since the kal v'chomer is based on it. So it must be that, right, preventing animal suffering is what's really going on here. And so even though you're helping a person with his business by unloading his animal or even loading his animal, there is an underlying principle that if you see an animal suffering, you have to help. And therefore, it's by Torah law to save animals for suffering. Now, I'm not saying that's the law. I'm saying that's what is being examined. Is it so that saving animals from suffering is something that we learn out from here? Remember that the way the Torah commandment is stated is that if you see your fellow's animal suffering, right, your fellow Jew, that his animal is suffering, even if your fellow Jew is your enemy, right, he hates you, you hate him, still you're going to go over there and help him unload the animal. It must be that you're helping. Why are we doing that? To prevent the suffering of the animal. Or is it a different teaching? Is it more of a spiritual teaching about helping your enemy, even your enemy, and the fact that, an animal is suffering is kind of incidental? Like, which is it? That's what they're trying to figure out. So just here. So the Gemara looks to another proof. Know, K-N-O-W, know that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is by Torah law. As it is taught in the latter clause of our Mishnah, the Rabbi Yosef HaGalili says, if there was a burden upon the animal greater than its typical burden, one need not attend to it, as it is stated, under its burden. So Rabbi Yosef holds that the obligation to unload an animal is with regard to a burden that the animal can bear. Does this not indicate by inference that the first Tana holds that he must attend to it to unload a burden that is greater than the typical burden? And what is the reason for this? In other words, Rabbi Yosef HaGalili's opinion was the minority opinion. So it must be that the majority opinion is that even where the animal has a load that is greater than it can bear, you do involve yourself to save it from suffering, and that's by Torah law. And what is the reason for this ruling? Is it not due to the fact that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is by Torah law, not just by rabbinic law? And the Gemara rejects this proof. Perhaps it is with regard to the meaning of the phrase under its burden that they disagree. As Rabbi Yosef HaGalili holds that we interpret the phrase under its burden to mean a burden that the animal can bear, and the rabbis hold that we do not interpret the phrase under its burden in this manner. So the Gemara cites an additional proof. Know that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is not by Torah law. As it is taught in the former clause of the Mishnah, if the owner went and sat and said to a passerby, hey, since there is a mitzvah incumbent upon you to unload the burden, unload it. But in that case where the owner of the animal is not going to help, then the passerby is exempt, right? Unless the owner is old or infirm. As it is stated, you shall release it with him. That's what it says in Exodus 23:5. And if it enters your mind that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is by Torah law, what is it to me if its owner is working with the passerby? And what is it to me if the owner is not working with the passerby? If it's only about the animal, then why would I be exempt? Right? I need to save the animal from suffering. If the animal's owner is a jerk who doesn't care whether his animal is suffering or not, don't I need to step in? But that's not the law. The law says you're only going to help the owner if he needs help in order to unload the animal. But the Gemara, so that would mean that saving the animal from suffering is not by Torah law. But the Gemara rejects this approach. Actually, one could say that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is by Torah law. And when the Tana of our Mishnah exempts the passerby, when the owner does not participate in the unloading of the burden, do you maintain that exempt means completely exempt? Perhaps it means that the passerby is exempt from unloading the burden for free, but is obligated to do so for remuneration. And this is what the Merciful One said. If its owner is working with the passerby, perform the unloading with him for free. And if its owner is not working with the passerby, then you can perform the unloading for him, but you are entitled to remuneration. And actually, the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is by Torah law. So the Gemara now presents a mnemonic for a series of proposed proofs cited by the Gemara, because we still haven't established, is the commandment to save animals from suffering by Torah law or not? This assumes that it is a commandment, right? So is it in every case? No, right? So there's a limitation. It's not that you have a Torah obligation to save all animals in the world from suffering. We're limiting the number of cases. But in these cases is the obligation by Torah law or by rabbinic law. So the mnemonic, which is going to make less sense in English, is animal of, friend, enemy, collapser, right? So that's just a little bit of chapter headings for what's coming, or paragraph headings rather. So let us say that a Baraisa supports Rava's opinion that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is by Torah law. So if one encounters the animal of a Gentile collapsed under its burden, he tends to it and he unloads the burden, as he would the animal of a Jew. And the Gemara reasons, so granted, if you say that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is by Torah law, it is due to that reason that he would tend to it just as he would the animal of a Jew. But if you say that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is not by Torah law, why does he tend to it as he would to the animal of a Jew? The Gemara rejects this proof. There, one tends to the animal due to enmity. There is a different commandment, right, to help your fellow Jew that, unload his animal that's different than why you would help a non-Jew who's not a member of your tribe, is not under the same obligations, doesn't live the same lifestyle, etc. Why do you help unload the animal of a non-Jew, particularly in the world that the sages were living in? Because the non-Jews were dangerous, right? They lived among the Romans who, could basically with impunity kill Jews at any time. So you would definitely not do something that would sort of incur the enmity of your non-Jewish, neighbors. But that doesn't mean that you have the same obligation toward people outside your tribe as you do to people in your tribe. And by tribe, I just mean the Jewish people here, not one of the 12 tribes. So too, it is reasonable to explain the Baraisa in this manner, as it was taught in a different Baraisa, that if the animal of a Gentile was loaded with wine used for libation to idolatry, obviously we have to distance ourselves from idolatry in every way, and back then, all of the non-Jews living around the Jews were idolaters, right? And the stuff on their animals might well have been used in idolatry. So if the animal of a Gentile was loaded with wine used for libation to idolatry, and the animal is collapsed under its burden, so a Jew does not attend to it. Now, granted, if you say that the requirement to prevent suffering of animals is not by Torah law, it is due to that reason that he does not attend to the animal of the Gentile when that animal is carrying materials used in idolatry. But if you say that the obligation to save animals from suffering is by Torah law, why does he not attend to it? Isn't the animal suffering? And the Gemara answers that this is what the Tana is saying. And to load the animal with wine used for libation to idolatry, he does not attend to it. Loading an animal does not alleviate its suffering. Furthermore, the refusal of the Jew to handle the libation wine will not cause enmity, because he can explain that his religion precludes him from handling these materials. But to unload even the idolatrous wine from the animal would seem that you do help, and because of the suffering of the animal. So the Gemara suggests, come in here, proof from a Baraisa. If one encounters the animal of a Gentile collapsed under the burden of a Jew, He may refuse to unload the burden. As it is written, if you see the donkey of him that hates you collapsed under its burden, you shall forego passing him by, you shall release it with him. And by employing the phrase, you shall forego, the verse indicates that there are circumstances in which one may forego unloading the animal. And the Gemara reasons, and if you say that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is by Torah law, why is there the option of you shall forego? The Torah should have commanded only, you shall release it with him. And the Gemara answers actually say that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is indeed by Torah law. And there, the Baraisa is referring to a case of loading where suffering of animals is not a factor. When you're loading stuff on the animals, you're not preventing them from suffering. It's only when you unload their burden that you're preventing the animal from suffering. I am almost done, so questions or comments, please get them in now. The Gemara asks, if so, the latter clause of the Baraisa with regard to a case involving the animal of a Jew collapsed under the burden of a Gentile, it is written, you shall release it. And if the Baraisa is referring to a case of loading where suffering of animals is not a factor, why does the Baraisa state, you shall release it? The Gemara answers, it is because in that case there is suffering of the Jew, who is delayed while waiting for the animal to be loaded, right? He has financial suffering because he's waiting and he might not get to market in time to have business. And the Gemara asks, if so, then the law should be the same even in the first clause. Why is there no requirement to prevent the suffering of the Jewish partner in that case? And the Gemara answers, the ruling of the first clause is stated with regard to a Gentile donkey driver, and the Jewish owner of the burden is absent. So the ruling of the latter clause is stated with regard to a Jewish donkey driver, and one is obligated to prevent his suffering. And the Gemara asks, on what basis did you arrive at this definitive assertion that the animal of a Jew is driven by that Jew and the animal of a Gentile is driven by that Gentile? The Gentile might hire a Jewish donkey driver, the Jew might hire a Gentile donkey driver. And the Gemara answers, the typical state of matters is that a person follows his own donkey. And the first clause addressed the case of a Gentile's donkey, so presumably its driver is Gentile. And the latter clause addressed the case of a Jew's donkey, so presumably its driver is a Jew. And the Gemara questions the explanation that the Baraisa is referring to cases involving loading, but isn't it with regard to unloading that the phrase is cited in the Baraisa, you shall forego passing him by and you shall release it, are written? And the Gemara answers that he said to him, indeed, the fact that one need not unload the burden from the donkey in the first clause of the Baraisa indicates that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is not by Torah law. In accordance with whose opinion is this Baraisa? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei HaGalili, who says that the requirement to prevent suffering to animals is not by Torah law. But that is a minority opinion because the rabbis disagree. And this would seem to indicate that the majority of the sages held that the obligation to prevent animals from suffering, to save them from suffering, is by Torah law. But we have not concluded that discussion, and we'll pick it up tomorrow with further proofs offered by the sages to show that the requirement to save animals from suffering is by Torah law. Let's take some questions. On Bava Metzia 32. And tomorrow, by the way, class will be an hour late like last week. I have continuing post-production on our movie, Guns N' Moses. So tomorrow night's class will be at 7 p.m. and so will Tuesday. Wednesday, we should be returning to the regular 6 p.m. Pacific schedule. But tomorrow, Monday, and Tuesday, it's going to be an hour later than normal at 7 p.m. Tom, can he appoint an agent to return it? So very interesting. I think what you're talking about is the one who would be giving up a lot of income in order to return a lost object. Can he appoint an agent to do the returning for him and in that way fulfill his obligation to return the lost object, but not give up his valuable time? I think that's a fantastic question. I think the answer is yes, but I'm not sure. right? Because if he appoints the agent, then the agent is acting for his principal. He was sent on a mission by his principal to return the lost object. And it's a great question, who is then performing the mitzvah of returning the lost object? Is it the principal who, appointed the agent? Is it the agent who's actually doing the returning? Are they teaming up to do it together? And what are the ramifications of that? I'm not sure. Great question. Elvis, remember Torah portion Korach. The wicked Korach, his sons, who did not follow him into rebellion, were spared, thus teaching us that obedience to Hashem overrides even honoring our parents in the case if and when they violate Torah. Beautiful, beautiful illustration of this, that if your father, commands you or tells you to, go break a Torah law, then we don't listen to the parent, even though we would then not be honoring our parents, because we don't honor our parents by listening to them to go break a Torah law. Joseph, I tend to take the fifth commandment primarily about the obligation of a child to obey the teachings of the parent as they model a Jewish life. So to disobey a parent who is not living according to Torah is honoring God above others. Does that make Talmudic sense here? 100%. You just showed that you understood exactly what the Gemara says. Very beautiful restating of it. Well done. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we will be together again tomorrow, Monday, at the special time for this Monday and Tuesday of 7 p.m. Pacific, 1 hour later than normal. Have a good night.